The British Empire was once described as the empire on which the sun never set, stretching across continents, seas, and cultures. But what seemed like an unstoppable global force eventually crumbled. The story of its collapse is not just about wars or politics, it's about economics, identity, resistance, and change. At its height, in the early 20th century, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's population and territory. It was larger than any empire before it. London was the beating heart of global trade, finance, and power. Yet less than a century later, much of this vast empire had slipped away. Colonies declared independence, protectorates vanished, and the prestige of Britain was reduced to a memory. What happened? To understand the collapse, we first need to look at how the empire functioned. For centuries, Britain relied on naval dominance, trade monopolies, and the extraction of resources. It was built on a mix of commerce, coercion, and colonization. But every empire has limits. Beneath the surface of power lay contradictions: resentment in colonies, the cost of wars, and the challenge of keeping such a vast system running. The seeds of collapse were planted long before the final unraveling. The American Revolution in the late 18th century showed that colonial resistance could succeed. Britain lost its most valuable colonies in North America, but shifted focus to Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. The 19th century became the so-called imperial century. India was considered the jewel in the crown, providing immense wealth and manpower. British merchants dominated world trade, and industries in Manchester and Birmingham fueled global markets. But even at the height of power, cracks began to appear. Industrial rivals like Germany and the United States rose quickly, challenging Britain's economic supremacy. The empire was also expensive to maintain. Garrisoning troops, building naval fleets, and suppressing revolts cost far more than politicians admitted. Meanwhile, colonies were not passive. From Ireland to India, nationalist movements gained momentum. Educated elites in the colonies questioned British rule and demanded self-determination. The First World War accelerated these pressures. Britain emerged victorious, but at an immense cost. Millions of soldiers had died, the economy was weakened, and debts to the United States mounted. After the war, promises of self-government had been made to many colonies. But when Britain tried to hold on to power, resentment only deepened. The empire had won a war, but lost much of its legitimacy. The interwar years saw the rise of independence movements. In India, leaders like Gandhi and Nehru mobilized mass resistance. In the Middle East, borders drawn by Britain created instability and resentment. In Africa, calls for liberation grew louder. Then came the Second World War, a true turning point. Britain again emerged on the side of the victors, but this time the cost was catastrophic. The war left Britain bankrupt, dependent on American loans, and unable to sustain a global empire. The United States and the Soviet Union now stood as superpowers. Britain, once dominant, had to face the reality of decline. Almost immediately after 1945, decolonization accelerated. India gained independence in 1947, a seismic moment that showed Britain's empire could no longer hold. Other colonies followed: Burma, Ceylon, and much of Africa in the 1950s and 60s. Each independence movement reduced Britain's global influence. Economically, Britain could not compete with the industrial might of the United States or the planned economy of the Soviet Union. The empire that once drove world trade was now struggling to rebuild its own cities from wartime destruction. There were also social changes. The people of the colonies no longer accepted being second-class citizens in their own homelands. The rhetoric of freedom used during the wars backfired, as colonized peoples demanded those same freedoms. Britain also faced crises within its remaining colonies. In Kenya, The Mau Mau uprising challenged British rule with brutal consequences. In Malaya, a long insurgency forced Britain to reconsider its grip on Asia. By the 1960s, the winds of change were unstoppable. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan famously acknowledged this in his Wind of Change speech, admitting that African nationalism could not be ignored. The Suez Crisis of 1956 symbolized the empire's collapse more than any single event. When Britain, alongside France and Israel, invaded Egypt to retake the Suez Canal, international pressure, especially from the United States and the Soviet Union, forced them to withdraw. It was a humiliating moment, proving Britain was no longer the world's policeman. After Suez, the empire unraveled quickly. Dozens of African nations declared independence. The Caribbean colonies sought self-rule. Even territories like Hong Kong would eventually slip away. But why did the collapse feel so sudden? Part of the answer lies in how fast global politics changed. The Cold War created a world where old-style empires had no place. The age of nation-states had arrived. Economic realities also played a role. Britain could no longer afford to maintain overseas garrisons, fund colonial administrations, or enforce trade monopolies. Global trade had shifted, and Britain's industries lagged behind. Cultural change was equally important. British citizens themselves grew weary of empire. After 2 world wars, the appetite for overseas expansion was gone. Ordinary people wanted welfare, healthcare, and reconstruction, not colonial adventures. At the same time, immigration from former colonies reshaped Britain itself. People from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa arrived to rebuild post-war Britain, transforming its society into something far more diverse. This created a paradox. The empire ended, but its legacy lived on within Britain itself. Language, food, culture, and identity were forever altered by centuries of imperial rule. Some historians argue that Britain didn't lose its empire. It simply transformed it. The creation of the Commonwealth allowed former colonies to maintain ties while enjoying independence. Others argue that the collapse was inevitable. No empire could hold so many territories forever, especially in the face of modern nationalism and global economic shifts. The legacy of empire remains controversial. For some, it was an age of progress, trade, and global connectivity. For others, it was exploitation, racism, and oppression. The truth is somewhere in between. The empire both connected and divided the world, leaving behind railways, borders, conflicts, and shared cultures. The collapse of the British Empire wasn't a single event, but a long process stretched across decades, from the loss of America, to the independence of India, to the Suez humiliation, to the wave of African liberation. Each step weakened the imperial structure. By the late 20th century, Britain had become a medium-sized European power, still influential, but no longer an empire. Yet the story doesn't end there. The echoes of empire continue to shape world politics. Conflicts in the Middle East, borders in Africa, and disputes in Asia often trace back to British rule. Even in Britain itself, debates about identity, immigration, and history are deeply tied to the legacy of empire. So why did the British Empire collapse? It collapsed because it faced forces bigger than itself, wars it could not afford, rivals it could not outcompete, and peoples it could no longer control. It collapsed because the world changed, and Britain could not change fast enough. It collapsed because every empire, no matter how vast, eventually reaches its limits. And in the end, the empire that once claimed to rule the world was brought down not by a single enemy, but by the weight of history itself. The story of the British Empire's fall is not just about Britain. It's about the rise of nations, the power of resistance, and the unstoppable demand for freedom. The empire may have collapsed, but its legacy, both good and bad, remains written into the modern world.